Amidst the darkness of their own pasts, for lost travelers find a flickering candle in a window, an unexpected beacon of hope that promises to guide them home, but only if they dare face the deepest shadows within themselves. Will they find peace, or will the past forever haunt them? Listen till the end to discover the light that burns brighter than any darkness they've ever known. The sun was dipping low behind the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, casting a golden hue across the path as it wound through the dense forest. The air was cool and thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jonas trudged forward, his boots heavy with the weariness of days on the road. His hands, calloused and rough, gripped the hilt of his sword, though it had long since ceased to feel like a weapon. Now it was just another reminder of the things he had done, of battles fought and people lost. Behind him, Elena walked with a slight limp, her face turned towards the ground, avoiding the growing shadows as though they held something she could not bear to face. She was young, no more than 20, but already the weight of the world seemed to have settled on her small shoulders. Her eyes, usually bright with curiosity, were now clouded with a deep, quiet sorrow. Beside her, Hassan moved with the practiced ease of a soldier, though his steps were more hesitant than usual. His eyes darted from side to side, always on alert, as though the forest itself was an enemy to be watched. He had seen enough bloodshed to be distrustful of peace, and though his armor was battered, it still gleamed faintly under the dying light. His past haunted him with every movement, every breath, but he kept it locked away behind walls of discipline. Anna, the oldest of the group, was silent as she walked, her back slightly bent beneath the invisible weight of grief. Her eyes had once been filled with the warmth of a mother's love, but now they were hollow, as though the spark of life had been snuffed out the moment she had lost her family. The small bundle in her arms, wrapped tightly in cloth, contained what was left of the life she had known. The four of them were strangers, bound together by circumstance and the shared journey of survival. They had met on the road weeks ago, each seeking something, each running from something. They had found companionship of sorts in their shared suffering, but it was a fragile bond. The road had been long and they had crossed miles of difficult terrain. They had weathered storms, fought off wild beasts, and confronted their own doubts and fears. But now, as they neared the edge of the forest, something changed. They could feel it in the air, a soft shift in the atmosphere, a promise of something different. And then Jonas saw it, a flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the dense trees but unmistakable. A light, Jonas murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. Do you think it's a village? Elena asked, her voice hopeful, though there was a nervous edge to it. Could be, Hassan replied, his tone skeptical. Or it could be a trap. You never know out here. Anna raised her hand to her forehead, squinting into the growing dusk. A candle, she said quietly. It looks like a candle in the window. Jonas's heart tightened. There was something about the flickering flame that called to him. It wasn't just the promise of shelter, it was the symbol of something he hadn't felt in years. Oh, we should at least check it out, Elena suggested, her voice gaining strength. Jonas hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Let's go. We'll stay together. The group made their way toward the light, their steps quickening as the path ahead opened up into a small clearing. The cottage that stood at the edge of the forest was modest but welcoming. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of the candle in the window flickered like a beacon. It seemed to promise safety, warmth, and perhaps even a moment of peace. As they approached the door, it creaked open before they had a chance to knock. A woman stood there, her face framed by the soft glow of the candlelight. Her hair was silver, though she couldn't have been more than 50. She had a kind face, weathered by years but still radiating warmth. You have traveled far, she said, her voice low but full of compassion. Come inside. You are welcome here. Without waiting for them to respond, she stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The warmth that hit them as they crossed the threshold was a stark contrast to the chill of the night outside. The interior of the cottage was simple, but it held a sense of peace. The hearth crackled with a cheerful fire, and the smell of fresh bread and soup filled the air. They sat around the table, accepting the woman's hospitality without hesitation. The firelight danced across their faces as they ate in silence, the warmth of the food and the room slowly easing the tension in their shoulders. After a while, Jonas set his bowl down and looked across the table at the woman who had welcomed them so freely. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "We've been traveling for days. We didn't expect to find a place like this." The woman smiled gently. "It is my pleasure. You are safe here." Anna, who had been silent for most of the meal, spoke up. "Why do you live out here so far from the village? Aren't you lonely?" The woman's smile softened, and she seemed to consider the question for a moment. "Loneliness comes in many forms," she said quietly. "I have found that it is not the absence of people that brings solitude, but the absence of peace within." The words hung in the air, and the travelers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. There was something comforting about the woman's presence, but also something mysterious, an unspoken wisdom that seemed to fill the room. Jonas leaned forward slightly. "Why do you keep the candle burning in the window? Is it for travelers like us?" "Yes," the woman replied. "The candle in the window is a light for those who have lost their way. It is a sign of welcome, of home. It reminds us that, no matter how far we stray, there is always a way back." The words were simple, yet they struck Jonas deeply. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. A longing, perhaps, for a place he had long since abandoned. A place he had lost, not on the road, but in his own heart. Hassan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes narrowed in thought. "And what if we don't know where home is?" he asked, his voice guarded. The woman met his gaze, her eyes steady and unblinking. "Then you must seek it. Sometimes the journey to find home is the most important part. It teaches us who we truly are." Elena looked down at her hands, tracing the edges of her worn leather gloves. "I've been searching for so long," she said softly. "I don't know if I'll ever find what I'm looking for." The woman's gaze softened as she turned to Elena. "You've already begun the search, child. The first step is the hardest, but once you take it, the road becomes clearer." Jonas swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He thought of the years he had spent running, of the mistakes he had made. He thought of the people he had hurt and the parts of himself he had left behind. Could there still be a way back for him? Could he still find peace? The woman studied him for a long moment, as if reading the questions that weighed heavily on his heart. Then she smiled, a warmth in her eyes. "There is always a way home," she said quietly. "And it begins with forgiveness." Jonas blinked, the words sinking into his soul like a quiet storm. He didn't know why, but something in him shifted. The road ahead, long and uncertain as it was, suddenly seemed less impossible. They finished their meal in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled on, the candle in the window flickering gently in the soft night breeze. For the first time in a long while, the weight of their burdens felt a little lighter. And as the night deepened and the first stars appeared in the sky, Jonas realized that the journey they had embarked upon was not just one of distance. It was one of the heart. The next morning, the travelers awoke to the soft crackle of the fire still burning in the hearth. The air inside the cottage felt heavy with warmth, a comfort Jonas hadn't experienced in so long. He stretched his arms and felt a strange kind of relief, as though the weight he had carried for years was slightly lifted by the simple act of rest. The woman, Miriam, she had introduced herself as, was already at the stove, stirring something in a pot. The smell of freshly brewed tea filled the small room, mixing with the scent of the wood burning in the fireplace. Jonas lingered by the window, his gaze drawn outside. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light across the forest clearing. The night's shadows had retreated, but his thoughts remained clouded. "Is it true?" Elena's voice interrupted his thoughts. She was standing behind him, her soft voice breaking the stillness. "Can we really go home?" Jonas turned to face her, unsure how to respond. She was standing with her arms crossed, looking small and uncertain in the soft light of the morning. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw a vulnerability that mirrored his own. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But the road ahead is not just about getting somewhere. It's about finding something inside ourselves. I think this place is meant to help us find that." Hassan entered the room just then, his movements purposeful as always. He offered a nod of acknowledgement to Jonas and then turned his gaze to Miriam, who was busy preparing the meal. "How long will we stay here?" Hassan asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been constantly on the move, always searching for something. Miriam glanced up at him, her gaze warm but knowing. "You can stay as long as you need, but be aware, there is a cost to every journey. A cost that goes beyond the miles traveled." The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. The silence was broken only by the sound of the tea being poured into cups. Anna, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, looked up then, her eyes dark with unshed tears. "How do we know when the journey is over?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. "How do we know when we've found what we were searching for?" Miriam smiled gently and set the teapot down. "When you stop running," she replied. "When you stop searching outside of yourself and find what you need within." Jonas felt something stir inside him at her words. He had spent so many years running, haunted by memories of his past, chasing after something that always seemed just out of reach. He had never stopped to ask himself if what he was searching for even existed. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to look inward. The group spent the day in quiet contemplation, each of them reflecting on Miriam's words. They ventured outside in the late afternoon to explore the grounds around the cottage. The land was peaceful. Lush green meadows stretched out in every direction, dotted with wildflowers, and a small stream trickled nearby, its soft murmur blending with the gentle wind rustling through the trees. Miriam seemed at ease in this space, moving like she was part of the land itself. She shared stories about the place, about how her family had lived here for generations, taking in travelers, offering them shelter and guidance. It was clear that this cottage was more than just a home for her. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing for those who had lost their way. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the landscape, Jonas found himself sitting by the edge of the stream. Elena joined him after a while, her footsteps light on the grass. She sat down beside him, her gaze distant. "Do you think we're really lost?" she asked, her voice small. Jonas thought for a long moment before answering. "I think we all are in our own way. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's just part of finding where we need to be." Elena nodded slowly, as though the words were settling into her heart. She smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her eyes. "I never thought I would feel at home anywhere again," she confessed, her voice cracking. "After my parents, after the fire, I thought I'd never be whole again." Jonas turned to her, his heart aching. He had always known the weight of loss, but hearing her pain made it even more real. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her the only comfort he could. "You're not alone," he said softly. "None of us are." That night, the travelers gathered around the fire in the hearth, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The atmosphere was calm, but there was an underlying tension, something unspoken, something each of them carried within themselves. Miriam, however, remained a constant presence, her peaceful demeanor never faltering. After a long silence, Hassan broke the quiet. "We all have our demons," he said, his voice low but firm. "And sometimes they follow us no matter how far we run." Miriam turned her gaze to him, her eyes calm but knowing. "Demons are not always what we think. Sometimes they are just parts of ourselves that we haven't come to terms with." Hassan's eyes narrowed. "You mean, our pasts? The things we've done?" "Yes," she replied softly. "Forgiveness is not just for others, it is for ourselves. Without it, we remain trapped, and the past will always hold us in chains." Jonas shifted uncomfortably. He had never been one to dwell on forgiveness, not for others and certainly not for himself. It seemed too impossible. His past was full of mistakes, decisions that had hurt others, hurt him, and no amount of forgiveness would undo that damage. Or so he had thought. But Miriam's words pierced through that wall. What if forgiveness was the key? What if it wasn't about fixing the past but letting go of it? As if sensing his thoughts, Miriam turned to Jonas. "The light you seek is not in the past," she said gently. "It is in the present. You cannot move forward until you let go of the things that weigh you down." The room was quiet for a long time after that, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. The next day, Miriam gathered the travelers together by the hearth and began to tell them the story of the candle. It was an old story, passed down through her family for generations. "Many years ago," Miriam began, her voice soft but filled with conviction, "my great-grandmother lit a candle in the window to guide a lost traveler back home. She had no idea who the traveler was or where they had come from. But she knew that they needed help, and that the light of the candle would show them the way." Elena leaned forward, captivated by the tale. "The traveler arrived in the middle of the night, seeking shelter, much like you did," Miriam continued. "And just like you, they were lost, not just in the world but in their heart. They didn't know where they were going or even if they wanted to go anywhere at all. But that candle, that light in the window, gave them hope. It reminded them that there was always a way home, even when the road seemed impossible." Hassan's gaze softened as Miriam's words settled in. "And the traveler found their way home?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Miriam nodded. "Yes, but not in the way they expected. They found peace, not in a destination but in themselves. The candle was not just a guide for the body but for the soul." Jonas sat quietly, the weight of Miriam's story pressing on him. The light of the candle had always been a symbol of hope to him, but now it felt more like a challenge. Could he find his way back not just to a physical place but to peace within himself? That evening Miriam gave them a challenge. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will each go out into the forest alone, with only the light of the candle to guide you. The journey will be different for each of you, but you must trust in the light. Trust that it will lead you where you need to go." Jonas hesitated. The thought of venturing into the wilderness alone, with only the flickering light of a candle, felt daunting. But there was something in Miriam's eyes, a quiet confidence, that made him want to trust her. The next morning, one by one, they ventured out into the forest, each holding a candle. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and the wind rustled the leaves, sending shivers down their spines. But they walked forward, their steps steady, their eyes fixed on the soft light in their hands. As Jonas walked deeper into the forest, he felt the familiar weight of his past creeping in. He thought of the people he had hurt, the choices he had made. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, but he kept his eyes on the light of the candle, trusting that it would guide him through the storm of his thoughts. After what felt like hours, Jonas found himself standing at the edge of a small clearing. The light from his candle illuminated the space before him, casting long shadows across the trees. And there, in the center of the clearing, he saw something that made his heart race. A figure. At first he thought it was a mirage, but as he drew closer he saw the figure clearly. It was a man, weathered and old, sitting on a stone. His clothes were tattered, but his eyes were calm, peaceful. "Who are you?" Jonas asked, his voice shaking. The man looked up, his gaze wise and knowing. "I am you," he said simply. Jonas blinked, unsure of what he had just heard. But as he stood there, the realization began to sink in. The man was not a stranger. He was the embodiment of Jonas's past, a manifestation of everything he had done wrong, everything he had failed to do. "I've been running from you for years," Jonas whispered. "I've been running from myself." The man nodded as if understanding. "You've been running from the only thing that could set you free." Jonas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The candle flickered brightly, casting light on the figure before him. And in that moment, he realized what he had been seeking all along. Forgiveness. When Jonas returned to the cottage that evening, the weight in his heart had lifted. The darkness that had followed him for so long seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet peace he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. The others had returned as well, each of them visibly changed. Elena was the first to speak, her voice strong and clear. I found my way, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I found my home. Hassan nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. The light guided me through my fears, he said quietly. Anna too spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. I faced the memories I've been hiding from. And I forgave myself. Miriam watched them all with a knowing smile. You have all found your way, she said softly. Now you must carry the light with you. Jonas looked out the window, where the candle in the window flickered in the soft evening breeze. He knew now that the light was not just a symbol but a living force, something that burned brightly not only in the window but in each of them. And as the days passed, the travelers found that they had not just found their way back to the world, but back to themselves. The village had been waiting for them. When Jonas, Elena, Hassan, and Anna returned to the small town nestled at the edge of the forest, they found it just as Miriam had said, a place of homecoming. The villagers greeted them with open arms, their hearts warmed by the stories of their journey. They stayed for a while, helping the village in any way they could. They shared their experiences, their lessons of forgiveness, of self-healing, and of the power of a simple candle to light the way when darkness seemed overwhelming. Miriam's house remained a symbol for them all, a sanctuary where they could always find peace, and the candle in the window remained lit, a reminder that no one was ever truly lost. One evening, as the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Jonas stood by the window of the cottage, looking out at the peaceful scene before him. The candle flickered softly in the window, its light bright and steady. It had been a long road, but he had finally found his way. Not just back to the village but back to himself. And as he watched the light dance in the window, he knew that it wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a promise. The candle would always burn. Years passed and the travelers moved on with their lives. They each took different paths, but they always carried the lessons of their journey with them. Jonas found a new purpose in life, helping others who were lost, just as Miriam had helped him. And the candle in the window of that small cottage continued to burn, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. It stood as a symbol of love and forgiveness, guiding lost souls back home, wherever that home might be. Jonas, now older, stood one last time before the window, the soft light of the candle reflecting in his eyes. The light within him had never burned brighter. And he knew it never would go out. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.